for example. But anyway, today we have 4 experts on the matter. So our first speaker is Robert Chote, who was the first chairman of the Office of Budgetary Responsibility. Before that, he was director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Before that, he was a journalist. And before that, he was one of my students in Cambridge, so broadly defined. Our second speaker is James Murray, who's the MP for Ealing North, having previously been a councillor in Islington, where I happen to live, and he's Shadow Financial Secretary. Then we have 2 members of the home team in the panel, Julian Limberg and Inga Rademacher. So without further ado, could we start with you, Robert, please? Each speaker will speak for 10 to 12 minutes and we'll then have general discussion. So Robert, please.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Martin. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event. As Martin said, I am one of his former students. He taught me everything I know about economics, but unfortunately didn't teach me everything he knows about economics. But I've been busking away as best I can ever since. There are lots of topics that we could discuss on the theme of taxation and democracy post-COVID. But I'm going to just initially talk about 3 that reflect my background working as a fiscal watchdog or in fiscal watchdogs, first at the OBR and now just getting underway with a similar, slightly different task in Northern Ireland, namely the policy and forecast process, the legacy of COVID for the public finances and the implications that may have for taxation and spending, and on broader attitudes to the role of tax and spending policy, but then obviously happy to talk about other issues. To begin with the first of these, I think that one key challenge to promote good tax and spending policy coming out of COVID is going to be to restore a proper process around fiscal forecasting and policy development at budgets and other fiscal events. There are now there are more than 40 official but independent fiscal watchdogs around the world. And when the OBR was created back in 2010, the government took the brave and unusual decision not merely to have us comment on the government's economic and fiscal forecast, but to take them over. So the task was essentially contracted out. And as a result, uniquely by international standards, the preparation of the fiscal forecast and the preparation of budgets in the UK involves a quite complex iterative process over several weeks of exchanging information between the OBR, the Treasury, Revenue and Customs and other departments as the details of the forecast and of the tax and spending package at any particular fiscal event are gradually firmed up. And this requires, if it's going to work and get you to the end point that you need to be at, a clear timetable set out well in advance and then adhered to. And whatever you think of the policy judgments that were made at the time, this worked pretty well in process terms during the coalition years, partly because most significant tax and spending measures required political sign-off by both governing parties, which imposed some additional timetable discipline. So gone were the days when a tax policy could be made and incorporated while the budget was actually at the printers. Problems still arose, of course, over that period, for example, when welfare reform proposals surfaced relatively late in this process because the Treasury didn't trust DWP not to leak them. Regrettably, the forecast and policy coordination process became messier in the years following the coalition, with less notice of when budgets were going to be and other statements, compressed timetables and poorer adherence to those deadlines. And that reflected, I think, a number of factors: the return to single party rule, less Treasury experience in number 10, more distance between PMs and chancellors, the weakening of the Treasury's authority by the result of the Brexit vote, the subsequent disruption of the parliamentary timetable by the negotiations, and most recently and most obviously, of course, the policy action required by the pandemic. the formal rules and informal practices that underpin the relationship between the OBR and the government in this forecast and policy preparation process was designed for a world in which fiscal policy essentially happens twice a year, not 14 times a year, as was the case between last year's budget and this year's. Do these process problems matter other than to the people directly involved with them? Well, yes, I think they do. They undermine transparency and credibility by increasing the risk of mistakes and three-way inconsistencies between the economic forecast, the fiscal forecast, and the policy package. Now, needless to say, exceptional circumstances justify exceptional actions. Fiscal policy has been and remains to a degree battlefield medicine after all. But if they become the norm, then the coherence and the credibility of the forecast process will be permanently damaged and the scrutiny of specific policy measures similarly weakened. So I think it's vital that once the acute phase of the COVID response and the disruption of the lockdown announcements ends, that we can get back to setting and observing proper and regular timetables for fiscal events and the formation of tax policy within that. That's important not just for Westminster, but also to help the devolved administrations plan their budgets as well. Now, the current Chancellor has never been in charge for a business as usual fiscal event. Proper process is not always the top priority at number 10, but I think the March budget was a step back in the right direction, and it should be said that this challenge isn't unique to the UK. Many watchdogs, fiscal watchdogs in many countries are concerned, at least some more than others, obviously, that recent procedural and legislative shortcuts justified by the COVID crisis may stick. Next, let me turn to the fiscal legacy of COVID. The key medium-term question for the public finances and for tax and spending decisions is to what extent the COVID shock is going to have lasting consequences for the public finances. So should we think of this as a huge but temporary increase in borrowing that simply pushes up the stock of debt relative to GDP but leaves the outlook for the deficit little affected? Or should we assume, as in the wake of the financial crisis, that we're also confronting a much increased structural budget deficit that, if unaddressed, would put the public finances onto an unsustainable path? And the need for and the urgency of any fresh policy action is going to depend on the answer. This all depends on a number of judgments, some of them economic and market related, and some depending on future policy decisions. The key economic question is the extent to which the COVID shock has scarred the future potential output of the economy, thanks to lost investment, business failures, labour market detachment. And the greater this scarring, the greater the proportion of the present budget deficit that's likely to persist in the absence of policy action. Now, the IMF, among others, has become more optimistic on this point, but frankly, I think we're still in the world of educated guesswork. Another judgment is the degree to which government borrowing costs, the interest rates that the government has to pay, are likely to hold down or increase the budget deficit in coming years. In forecast after forecast during my decade at the OBR, gilt yields fell, keeping debt servicing costs low even as the stock of debt continued to rise. But in recent months, that may have started to reverse. On the policy side, I think there are two key issues. The first is whether it will prove politically feasible to withdraw some of the temporary support put in place to help individuals and businesses through the crisis, on universal credit, for example. History suggests that governments find it very hard to make measures that impose concrete cash losses on households stick. The second is whether we emerge from the crisis wishing to spend a higher share of national income on public services, notably health and social care. The government is currently penciling in, I think, lower departmental spending than it did pre-crisis for the next few years, and that looks pretty implausible, as the OBR has hinted and as others have been free to say more bluntly. If we do want to spend more on health and social care, for example, then it's looking increasingly unlikely that that can be paid for easily by cutting other spending. The years of austerity have plucked a lot of high as well as low-hanging fruit. Having focused in the last budget on increasing corporate taxation, you might expect personal taxation, maybe national insurance or a variant thereof to be next. Let me finish with the broader debate around the role of fiscal policy and what we think of as prudent or sustainable management of the public finances. The COVID shock made bigger budget deficits and higher government debt a fait accompli. But even before the pandemic hit, the intellectual climate amongst both orthodox and heterodox economists had become less concerned about the dangers that might pose. And this came on top of an understandable and widespread sense of austerity fatigue among voters. The orthodox argument, put forward most famously by Olivier Blanchard, was that government borrowing costs were likely to remain below the expected growth rate of the economy for the foreseeable future, and that one-off jumps in public debt were therefore unlikely to prompt an upward spiral. Larry Summers and Jason Furman, again in the US, went further and argued that it would be safe to run larger budget deficits for longer for the same reason, essentially. They added, quite strikingly, that the deficit would be easy to reduce if the need arose and financing conditions became more challenging. Although I think the experience of the past decade certainly suggests that it would be far from straightforward on either the tax or spending side. To some people's surprise, Blanchard and Summers have opposed Joe Biden's recent expansionary budget package in the US, but that's very much because of the risk of inflation rather than because they think it's unaffordable in terms of debt dynamics. The heterodox argument comes in the form of modern monetary theory, or MMT, an offshoot of the functional finance approach advanced by Abba Lerner back in the 1940s. And that asserts that fiscal sustainability is essentially a meaningless concept for a government that can issue its own widely accepted currency because it can simply resort, if needs be, to the printing press. As Lerner wrote in 1943, budget deficits are, quote, no danger to society, no matter what unimagined heights the public debt might reach. In this world, taxes aren't required to repay for public spending per se, but rather as a way to remove spending power from the economy and stop inflation from taking off. So in practice, MMT would imply a return to the use of fiscal rather than monetary policy as the main tool to manage demand, but greater use of central bank reserve creation instead of or alongside the issuance of government bonds to finance budget deficits. MMT supporters favour these changes in part because they take a dim view of central banks. Professor Stephanie Kelton has argued in her book that, quote, we must end the cruel and inefficient practice of relying on democratically unaccountable central bankers to target the right mix of inflation and unemployment. She argues that the Federal Reserve in the US tends to be too hasty and snatches away the punch bowl before the party has even had a chance to warm up, let alone get out of hand. She argues that in addition to acting with greater democratic legitimacy, legislators would make a better job of demand management. I have doubts about that. If boffin-packed central banks find it difficult to assess the amount of slack in the economy and to respond to portents of inflation in a timely manner, it's hard to imagine that a cumbersome, politicised legislature would find it any easier, especially when the choice and timing of counter-inflationary tax increases would likely be very contentious with voters who are already confronting a squeeze on their incomes. So this MMT debate, I think, offers an interesting lens through which to view the task of economic management, and you can debate how well it would work in practice. But I think the view it takes of taxation is particularly interesting in the context of this discussion and could have interesting political implications. Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said that taxes are the price we pay for civilization, the implication being that they pay for the public services, the redistribution of income, the insurance against nasty surprises that we and others benefit from. But Professor Kelton argues that at the end of the day, taxes serve, and I quote, to enable governments to provision themselves without the use of explicit force. In an MMT world, I suspect debates over tax would be even more heated than they are now. Very finally, looking back to my old job, neither the orthodox nor the heterodox critique necessarily implies that fiscal watchdogs would be redundant. They could help reassure people that fiscal activism is consistent with sustainability, and independent assessment of the fiscal position may be the best way to help demand management, MMT, not result in a bias towards inflation and deficits in the past. But if policymakers become fundamentally more relaxed about deficits and debts, then that clearly poses challenges for bodies of this sort. But under all scenarios, governments would continue to tax, spend, borrow and lend, perhaps in print, many billions of pounds, and robust independent scrutiny of how they do this and how their actions square with their words is still important to a well-functioning democracy. So let me leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. Without further ado, could we move on to James Murray, please? James, over to you.
Thanks very much, Martin, and thank you for having me along to speak today. You mentioned in your introduction that you knew me when I was a councillor in Islington, so I'm just very much hoping that I didn't do anything as a councillor there to get on the wrong side of you, and you gives me a particularly hard time later on. So hopefully it was a pleasant experience having me as a councillor in your local area. But now, obviously, I'm the MP for Reading North, which is where I grew up, and I've been made a member of the Shadow Treasury team, the Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury. And one of the roles as Shadow Financial Secretary is to oversee the finance bill on behalf of the opposition as that goes through the House of Commons. And we're getting toward the end of the finance bill and its progress right now. Monday is going to be the report stage and third reading. And so I thought I would spend the few minutes I have to speak just talking about some of the political issues which have come up as a result of the debate on the finance bill, to hopefully add a bit of that political dimension to the discussion that we have later on. I think looking at where we are now, we all feel that hope because of the vaccine rollout. We know the health crisis is still going to be with us for some time to come. But I think the other thing which is really very clear is that the damage to jobs and the economy resulting from the pandemic, it really is going to be with us for a long time to come. And some of those effects are still playing out, which is why, although on the one hand we have the hope of the vaccine programme, we still need to be mindful about health. We need to be as mindful and potentially mindful for even longer about the impact on jobs and the economy and the effect that's going to have. And that's why going into this finance bill, when it was first published, we said it should have focused absolutely on supporting families and households through the difficulties they're facing as a result of the outbreak, focus on protecting and securing jobs, and then backing struggling businesses who have found it so difficult throughout the last 12 months or longer. I think what we also have been saying in response to the finance bill, as well as the budget back in March and the Queen's speech just recently, is that beyond an immediate response to the COVID crisis, the government needs to set out solutions to some of the bigger problems the country has been facing for many years. Climate change, the climate emergency is an obvious one, but also I think, as we've really seen throughout the outbreak, social care is a part of our lives that has been neglected for a long time and hasn't had the focus to get the right level of investment and get the right arrangements in place to make that sustainable. So I think whilst a lot of the response has to be seen through the lens of COVID, there are longer term problems as well, some of which have been made more acute or more attention has been drawn to by the outbreak, but which were there anyway, and which really have gone without a solution for quite a long time. What we saw, though, in the way the bill was presented, and we are there as the opposition, we are there to point out where this bill falls short and to point out where we think it should be done differently or better, is in the way that the bill hit family finances through many of its measures. And it was in the bill about freezing the personal tax allowances, which means that half the country is set to pay more. And that's a huge change if you think about it, particularly in the middle of a crisis where you want to protect people's incomes, not just for their own well-being, but also more widely in terms of money being spent on the economy. The freeze on personal allowances is something that it was in the bill and people may have not noticed it at the beginning, but as soon as you think through the implications of it, it has a huge impact on people right across the country, because everyone who's a taxpayer is affected by that. I think you have to see that in the context of some of the other measures the government were taking, which we were concerned about as well, which was the increase in council tax, which has gone ahead now, which is having an impact on households across the country. The planned cut to universal credit that Robert kind of referred to in his comments earlier, that the end of the £20 increase this autumn. And of course, one of the measures which got, and rightly so, a lot of attention in the media, which is around the effectively a pay cut for NHS workers by that 1% pay rise, which when taken into context with inflation, obviously is a real terms pay cut. And I think, when you take all of that together, we felt any of those measures would have been, very worrying. And I think taken together, they paint a picture where of the bill, the finance bill and the measures in the budget, not looking out for household finances in the way that, we should do at all times, particularly in the middle of an outbreak when people's lives have been disrupted and their jobs and their well-being has been under such pressure in recent years. I think the other aspect of the bill, which I focused on a lot, was around what the Chancellor spoke highly of, the so-called super deduction to try and encourage greater investment from British businesses and any businesses operating in Britain. And this was something that the Chancellor was seemed very keen to promote when he was setting out his budget, and in the finance bill, his ministers have followed that up. But what this represents is essentially a £25 billion tax cut over 2 years for companies to offset their investment against their tax liabilities. And whilst we need to encourage and support businesses, our feeling is that money or any investment there is to support businesses should go towards struggling British businesses who are finding it difficult to survive through the outbreak. And if you look at the detail in the finance bill, the annual investment allowance, which is another measure extended by the finance bill, already exists to give a 100% deduction for businesses making investments up to £1 million. So really, most small and medium businesses would already be largely covered by those measures. And this extra super deduction, this measure on top of that, would really end up benefiting a lot of the larger, sometimes multinational companies more. Some of the analysis done by third parties called it the Amazon tax cut. And obviously Amazon is a high-profile potential beneficiary of the super deduction, but it does highlight the fact that this is not a targeted measure. And actually, as Dame Margaret Hodge, whose place I'm speaking in today, set out during one of the debates on this bill, having a 2-year super deduction, which has an effect immediately, means that it will be those companies who have sort of oven-ready investment plans and have done very well during the pandemic are going to be in the best position to benefit from it, rather than encouraging longer-term growth or helping, as I said, British businesses which are struggling. So that was an issue which we had around that. And we tried to do some amendments at committee stage. You will all know the parliamentary arithmetic, and so will not be stunned to know that we didn't win those votes. We weren't able to win them in the House of Commons. We tried to stop the freeze on income tax personal allowances and to limit the super deduction from going to the big tech giants. We basically put in an amendment there to stop it going to any of the companies who are liable for the digital services tax, which is basically the big tech giants. We lost those votes, but it's timely speaking about this today because we're going to be bringing back one of them on Monday, which is around making sure that tech giants are excluded from that super deduction, because particularly if we're talking about priorities for public money and where it should go, we just don't believe that should be at the top of the list. The one final thing I wanted to speak about, because it's coming up on Monday when the bill comes back, is a further amendment we tabled around the global minimum corporate tax rate that President Biden has proposed, and are using the debate on Monday following various interventions I've made over the last 5 or 6 weeks in the chamber, to push the government about supporting President Biden's plans for a global minimum corporate tax rate. And I think this really is an issue of fairness in many ways, and part of the conversation around support for taxation does rely on a strong degree of fairness, and people feeling that everyone is paying the tax they should, and that no one is getting away without or avoiding paying the tax that they really ought to. And I think it's very embedded in in popular understanding that many of the big multinational firms, particularly online tech giants, have managed to get away without paying tax that they should have been paying for many years. And there has been a feeling this problem is really hard to solve and it requires international coordination. So, individual countries can't tackle it alone. I think the fact that Biden, as president of the US, has now put something on the table which would introduce a 21% global minimum corporate tax rate, could be a real game changer. Really could be a massive step forward. I'm not saying it solves all the problems or is perfect by any stretch, but it really is a game changer, and it offers the potential for that international collaboration, which so far feels like it's eluded us around the world. And so we'll be pushing the government on Monday on that matter. We are concerned about why they're not supporting it. We want to make sure that they are out there publicly supporting it. All the other G7 nations have said they back it. We are supposed to be hosting a G7 summit in Cornwall next month. It would be wrong and embarrassing, frankly, if the UK wasn't wholeheartedly behind it and taking a lead on pushing that. And I think, just to conclude, that argument around the global minimum corporate tax rate, I think, does get to the heart of this fairness argument. It is about making sure we've got the revenue we should be receiving to invest in the economy and infrastructure and so on in the UK. It's about making sure that British businesses who do pay tax in the UK like they should are not undercut by those multinationals who are able to shift their profits out of the country, and also more broadly around this value of fairness and trust in the taxation system and the belief that everyone is paying what they should and everyone is making a fair contribution.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for raising a range of questions, as well as giving an illustration of how tax changes actually arise and are discussed in a democracy. Anyway, now over to Inga, please.
Thank you very much. So I have a presentation on my research, and this is a paper that I call A Matter of Fairness, How Economic Narratives Shape Top Personal Income Tax Rates in the US and Germany. So you see it's actually on top personal income tax rates, not corporate taxation, and it's on Germany and the US, but I will try and draw some conclusions by the end of the presentation on what this means for the UK, but also more generally what types of conclusions we can draw for the COVID era and taxation in it. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the research on top personal income tax rates. So for a very long time, the literature has heavily focused on globalization issues, and James has already talked about them. So essentially, much of the literature focuses on the decline of the top personal income tax rates. So there's a lot of research on tax competition, on tax evasion, essentially smaller businesses pushing for lower top rates. Then there's a literature that's talking about a business revolt, essentially businesses and the rich no longer willing to pay high tax rates, especially once productivity declines, in the UK starting actually in the 50s already. And shifts in power, so essentially trade unions losing their stance in our societies, and therefore the top rate declining. So if we look at the development, and I'm trying to get this larger, but it doesn't want to. There we go. If we look at the development of the top personal income tax rate since the 1980s, and I have a bunch of OECD countries here, we do see that, in fact, it has declined significantly. So I don't want to question that there are pressures on economies to reduce these rates. But what I do in my research is kind of looking at these brief moments where these rates have increased. And Julian does that as well, I think, in some of his research. And essentially here, one of my cases is the Clinton case, and one of my cases is the Merkel case, so in Germany, where we actually see the rate increasing. And what I ask is, well, is there actually political agency in these in this field of policy making that we're not acknowledging? Is there, despite globalization pressures, maybe also some leeway to actually increase these rates again? And I am interested in finding out what are the conditions under which these rates can increase and under which conditions they stay at a relatively high level, because it doesn't really make sense to increase them and the next government cuts them again. So what I try to do is to look at the discourses, so the communication in parliaments over the rates, and try and figure out how successful policymakers sell their projects to parliament, voters, and the opposition. So I'm looking at the arguments that are developed around top personal income tax rates, try to determine what is a convincing argument in a parliament so that a larger group of parliamentarians actually support it. And the related political question is, and I'm going to get back to that by the end of the presentation, what could be the strategies that administrations, but also parties, can use to push other actors in parliament to actually increase the rate or decrease it, depending on what they want. So I tie this in so this is a political science project, and I tie it in with an approach that's called Discursive Institutionalism. Essentially what this approach does is not so much interested in the ideas itself, which a lot of the literature actually looks at, but more focusing on the interaction of actors in parliament particularly. And it kind of, gives me two different ideas that are really helpful to analyze these discussions. The first one is that usually these types of debates are more successful, so ideas are more successful if they are tied in with the traditions that are already existing in certain contexts. Yeah, so the traditions of ideas that have already been established, but also institutions that are already established. So essentially, if one were to propose a higher top personal income tax rate right now, after we've been talking about the top rate in relation to efficiency for 40 years, it wouldn't be advisable to just talk about justice. We would also have to talk about economic efficiency. And the second element that I find really useful is essentially what this literature shows is that discourses are highly successful, or debates are highly successful, if they tie in normative ideas and cognitive ideas. So more the types of principled beliefs, ideas of fairness on the one hand, and the more causal beliefs, ideas about economic efficiency and growth on the other side. So as soon as they are linked in with one another, we have a really good chance of winning more support for a certain project. So what I do in my research is essentially I read all the parliamentary debates in Germany and the US on the top personal income tax rate since the 1980s. And I essentially counted the frequencies of mentions of certain arguments and tried to determine which types of arguments became more prevalent and convince others to go along with them. Just to show you how this looks like, it's essentially a program where I have the document here, the debate here, and I read it, and I have an argument, in this case for ability to pay, and I essentially code it here in my coding tree, so I know, well, there were 55 arguments in favor of ability to pay, and I can actually trace what types of arguments have been used over time and how they changed over time. I just want to highlight two different ideas that I found were particularly important for the increases in the top personal income tax rate in Germany and the US. Interestingly, in both cases, these show up. The first one is the traditional argument of ability to pay. So essentially, people with higher incomes should also pay more tax, because it's a greater sacrifice for someone with a lower income to pay $1 of tax compared to a millionaire. Makes sense, I guess. And the second argument is an argument of distortion. And interestingly, In the 1980s, distortion is used by the center-right as an argument that tax has to be reduced because it impairs efficient allocation of resources. So tax has to be cut. But this gets turned around in the 1990s, especially under Clinton, by the center-left, and they argue that it's actually deficits that impair the efficient allocation of resources. So in the US, we see an argument that deficits have to be reduced through a higher top personal income tax rate so that you don't have this kind of push of resources out of the private market into the public, and which increase interest rates. And essentially, there's an idea this is going to help consumer finance and mortgage markets. So just to highlight this again, I have here the frequencies of mentions of different arguments in Germany. Here, this is the Merkel era. What we see is distortion is tied in with ability to pay, and the same happens in the US. Distortion is tied in with ability to pay, and these were the two successful cases where the top rate was actually increased. So what are the implications for COVID and maybe also for the UK? So what I see in my research is that there can be a successful strategy to actually increase the top personal income tax rate, if policymakers want that, if they tie in an economic narrative with a justice narrative, but they have to be highly consistent. Otherwise, it's easy to attack it, and then it usually fails or is reversed after a while. So I feel like this cannot just be a crisis argument, because that is rather short term. It would be good if it was a larger argument how the increase in the top rate can reinvigorate economic growth. And for instance, one way to do it would be to go back, obviously, to the more Keynesian consensus times of arguing that a state-led a framework of fiscal policy making would increase productivity, could be tied in with a Green New Deal, for instance. And the US is obviously also talking about this in this respect. And it kind of, it would have to acknowledge the existing traditions. So one could fall back onto the ability to pay argument, which I think is very strong in the British public discussion. And at the same time, it would have to acknowledge efficiency arguments. And I think one really good efficiency argument is that actually the income tax is a highly revenue effective tax. And that might be another way to do it. That was my presentation.
Thank you very much, Inga. Without further ado, could we move on to Julian, please? Julian, over to you. Are you on mute?
This should be better now, sorry.
That is better, yes, thank you.
So thank you very much. I prepared some slides. I hope you're able to see them. I've just put them up and shared them, which is a bit polemically called the COVID crisis of the tax state. I'll get a bit into that in a second. And the basic underlying question here is to think about whether the COVID-19 crisis can lead to some kind of modernization of the tax state. And some things that had been mentioned before and lead to some kind of a new approach to tax policy making, to fiscal policy making that might break with trajectories that we've seen in the last decades. And of course, the first way to do this is to look at policy changes that have been made in the last months, or I think by now you can also say year, because this has been going on for a year already. And of course, the first thing to mention here is the recent proposal by President Biden, which, you know, marks a quite radical departure from what many administrations previously has done. And I was very interested to hear these points that Inga made about connecting efficiency with ability to pay arguments, because from that perspective, one could say the speech that Biden held was exactly ticking those two boxes, actually. So the idea there is to, or what he has proposed was to reverse top personal income tax cuts, increase corporate income taxation, kind of set the way for global coordination of corporate income taxation and a few things more. Now, we've also already heard some things about the UK response, which, you know, many have seen as a bit more of a mixed bag with regard to that. Some of the things have been mentioned. It also includes something which would go against a conservative policy trajectory that we've seen beforehand. So raises, or at least scheduled increases of corporate income tax rates, but of course also a few other policy measures that would be considered more to be on the regressive side of tax policy making. So it's a bit of more of a mixed picture there, I would say. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, of course, we have the recent example of Colombia, where there was a proposed increase of value-added tax, more of a regressive tax, that was accompanied by huge protests. And just recently, the bill has been reversed again. And then finally, we also see some changes in what someone could call an even unlikelier case, and that is on the EU level. So the idea for the first time to issue common debt at the EU level has by some been described as the EU's Hamiltonian moment. Again, the judgment is out, so we can't say it ultimately, but it also came along with at least the future outlook to repay some of these debts with some kind of centralized fiscal instruments. Either it's carbon import taxation, may it be digital taxation, we don't know yet, but there is some kind of change taking place. Now, all of this are more, I would call them empirical vignettes, and we are at an early stage. So this is all very early evidence. So in order to get at this question, what I would like to do is to take a bit of a look back into history to see how crises have affected tax policy making in the past, and whether we could learn anything or make any more, you know, solid predictions. Well, not solid predictions, but at least more empirically informed predictions out of past tax policy development. And the starting point for me here is really this guy, which is Josef Schumpeter, an Austrian economist who wrote a path-breaking book in 1918 called The Crisis of the Tax State. So now you might think why I called the talk the COVID crisis of the tax state. Basically identifying some kind of crisis in 1918, and also making this quote, which I actually use a lot in my teaching as well, where he argues that if you want to discern the thunder of world history, you have to look in a country's tax code, basically. And the timing of this writing is, of course, not coincidentally. This was after the First World War. Central European Europe was in ruins. And somehow this was seen as a turning point, as a major crisis for tax policy making. So this is not a coincidental timing. And subsequently, his country, so he's Austrian, an Austrian economist, also fundamentally reformed its tax system, together with many other countries actually around the world. And for instance, introduced a general sales tax, so general tax on consumption, which basically in a reformed version is still in place today and remarks one of the main pillars of the tax aid. So almost 25% of revenue is made via this tax. This was invented then, this was reformed then. And this is, as I said, no coincidence. These major types of shocks, or wars and economic crisis, have been drivers of fiscal modernization for a long time in history. And just to give 3 empirical examples here, what I mean by this. The first one is on income and consumption taxation. So what you see here is out of a large-scale research project with Laura Seelkopf and a few colleagues of mine, where we collected data on when countries actually for the first time introduced something like an income tax, or first time something like a consumption tax, because they've not always been around. And here I just want to show you the data for the 20th century. So generally, these taxes are not that old. They're only a matter of the last 200 years. So general sales tax the last 100 years, and they somehow cluster, the introduction of these taxes somehow cluster around main crises. So here you can see it with the First and the Second World War, and also the Great Depression. This was often strongly connected. So these types of fiscal modernization for the first time taxing income, right, for the first time, taxing consumption for the first time, has always been strongly connected to a major crisis and wars. We can also see a similar pattern when we look at a text that has been discussed a lot in the last months and years, which is net wealth taxation. So in another project, we looked at whether countries actually have had a wealth tax at some point in history, and compared to income and consumption tax in fewer countries had. So roughly half of all countries. So we have in total, out of a sample of 45 OECD and Latin American countries, 22 have had a wealth tax, now 23 because Bolivia introduced one last year. And the vast majority of these countries introduced these wealth taxes right after a major recession. So these were really emergency tax instruments put in place and then stayed in place after this kind of economic crisis. And then finally, this is something I've been working on as well. And over the last years, we can also see that with regard to more recent crises. So this is from a paper of mine that looked at the impact of the Great Recession on top personal income taxes on countries worldwide, and looking at whether it actually had an impact, comparing those countries that had been affected by the financial crisis of 2008, which is the solid line here, with those that hadn't been affected by it. And we can see that top personal income taxes, so taxes on the highest income earners, rose substantially. And we can also run models on that, and we find an effect of roughly 4 percentage points, which is quite substantial if you think that the recent Biden proposal actually was an increase of top personal income tax rates of 2.5 percentage points. So bottom line of this is that over the long run of history, crises, wars, economic crises have strongly been related to modernization of the tax system. And kind of the question that arises, of course, well, does history repeat itself? Or in other words, can the COVID crisis have a similar modernization effect on the tax state? And I would say, and many have argued that way, that modernization is badly needed. There are several pressing issues that fiscal policy tools, which have often been put in place 100 years ago or older, might not be able to deal with anymore. Just to give you 3 short examples, and all of these have actually also been strengthened by the COVID-19 crisis. The first one is inequality dynamics, which have already been increasing, particularly with regard to wealth and top incomes beforehand, and have even been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. Another one that has already been mentioned, corporate tax avoidance, how to organize corporate taxation in the global economy, how to tax the digital economy. That's something which is a huge challenge for the modern tax state. And then finally, also environmental taxation, right? So how to put a price on carbon, arguably probably the biggest challenge, not only for tax system, but for mankind as a whole at the moment. So I would, coming back to the literature on the on the historical development of taxation and how crises have led to fiscal modernization, we can identify 3 main factors, and I want to stress these in order to conclude that will help, or that have to be fulfilled in order for COVID-19 to have a similar effect, modernization effect on the tax state. The first one is very straightforward, has been argued before. It's fiscal pressure, basically. So wars and recessions always come with a fiscal fallout. These are expensive, wars are expensive, recessions are expensive, you somehow need to pay for them. So that requires revenue demands, and that often automatically already leads to a better starting position to reforming existing fiscal institutions. And if we look at the data at the moment, we could say to a certain extent there is also fiscal pressure emerging. So this is data for the UK on public debt over the last 100 years. And we can see there's a strong increase already in public debt because of the reaction to the COVID-19 crisis. It's still not at the level that it has been over the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, but it's rising quite rapidly. The second factor is something that has also been mentioned beforehand, and that is how fairness is perceived, and particularly whether major shocks violate people's fairness principles, and by that induce demand for correction of these violation of fairness principles via taxation. Now, this sounds very academic, I would say, and let me put it to you a bit more in practical terms. So what we know from financial shocks and subsequent bailouts is that they were often seen as violations of people's fiscal fairness principles, because some parts of society have been treated preferentially, and demand to correct for this preferential treatment via making these, for instance, financial investors pay for their crisis often increased as a result. We see similar dynamics during wartime, with increased demand to, tax rich capitalists that had been profiting from war-induced demand for essential goods, whilst many younger people who weren't on the higher end of the income and wealth distribution died on the battlefield. Now, can we make similar arguments during the COVID-19 crisis? Well, to a certain extent, we have seen that inequality has been increasing, and to put it a bit very straightforward terms, it seems like richer people had a better crisis than poorer people. So this is a point you could make here, but also something that refers to taxing the digital economy that could be put forward, where demand due to government action and lockdowns for using services like Amazon has increased, because they were still able to operate while local high street a retailer couldn't operate anymore. And at the same time, of course, the local high street retailer often pays business taxes, while Amazon has more sophisticated ways of transfer pricing that don't lead to a high tax burden, put mildly. So this is actually something where these arguments could be made. It also remains to be seen how dominant they become in the public discourse, but this is actually a soil on which such arguments can be made quite strongly. And then finally, what we can see in history, and this is the last one actually, that what I want to put forward is that modernization of fiscal instruments demands broad societal coalitions. And historically, these reforms have been particularly strong if they're not only driven by leftist party politics and left parties, but they also had some kind of support from the center right. So somehow broader societal coalitions are needed. If we look at the income tax, for instance, it often wasn't only pushed for by the workers' movement, but also by coalition between workers and new economic elites that caused a rise in income taxation, actually. And the question here is, again, do we see that? And in order to get a bit at that, me and some colleagues filed some survey recently in the UK to find out what's the demand actually for taxing, for instance, wealth and high incomes. And we did that by an experiment, by asking two questions randomly. The first was, do you support higher taxes on wealth and high incomes to increase public revenue? The other one was, do you support higher taxes on wealth and high incomes to reduce inequality? So we randomly asked people one or the other question. And generally, we could see that support was high. There wasn't a big difference between asking these two questions, overwhelming support to do that. But if we differentiate by partisan affiliation, or by left-right affiliation, actually, and this is what you can see here, you can see that for people on the right, actually stressing the revenue-raising function of taxes leads to more support for these kind of tax increases. So there you can see there is room for cross-class coalitions if these different functions of taxes are actually used here. People or politicians who might engage in this kind of policy making might be able to make use of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That's given us plenty. Julian, could you turn your microphone off, please? That's given us plenty to think about. Now, if you'd like to ask a question or make a contribution, please could you raise your hand? The hand-raising technology on Teams is at the top right-hand side of the screen. In the meantime, perhaps if I could put a question to the panel, please. If I look at the sort of broad sweep of taxation from the beginning of the 20th century, and I stand to be corrected by Robert on this, we used to have really quite high tax rates on inheritances, on very large inheritances. We used, in the period certainly immediately after the Second World War, to have quite high taxes on income from capital and lower taxes on income from labour. of course, economists tended to argue that taxes that were collected from capital were nevertheless imposed on labour. The issue of incidence of taxation is, perhaps a bit complicated for voters to understand, but very important if you want to understand the consequences. Anyway, for one reason or another, we've seen a shift away from taxation of income from capital to taxation of income from labour. And I wonder whether the panel takes the view that that is likely to be reversed, if not permanently. Nothing's permanent with taxes, reversed on a semi-permanent basis. So could I float that question, please, to get us going? Maybe Robert, if you'd like to go first, please.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, if the argument for why that we've moved in the direction that you've described is partly around the globalization arguments and the fact that it's just harder to get the amount of feathers you get out of the goose is less for the amount of effort than it was at an earlier time, then maybe it's harder to push that. I think another interesting question, and it comes a bit with Inga's paper as well, that, and I'm struck in the US, for example, that in a way, listening to the argument, you kind of wonder, well, the question is not why is it so hard to get the higher rate of tax up, doesn't it go up more often, given that it's so far away from the median voter? And in the US, there's, I don't know whether this is still the case, but certainly some while ago, one thing that was striking was that the amount of popular opposition to increases in the estates tax, so the inheritance tax effectively, despite the fact that such a small proportion of the US population had any realistic expectation of ever paying it. And partly there was a specific US context of a surprisingly high proportion of the population having some hope in the American dream of one day being in the position of playing that. But the striking fact that there is opposition even to those sort of capital taxes that you describe amongst people in the middle of the income distribution who are unlikely to be affected by it may still be a factor heading in that direction. And obviously, one of the issues in the UK context is many of the bringing together fairness and the purposes around the change are even more pertinent, obviously, for taxes imposed on people of middle incomes, because there are more of them and you can get more revenue out of it. So when Labour increased national insurance, effectively a Labour tax, in the early 2000s, that was regarded, I think, by the government at the time as sort of being a major political economy triumph in having persuaded people that this was money that was going to a particular purpose. So I don't know whether you have any, or Inga or others would have any sense of this surprising disconnect between, the median voters' view and their likelihood of being hit by this, and whether that helps shed any light on Martin's question.
Well, James, could I put that to you now, please? Why have we seen this reduction in rates? As Robert said, a long way from the a long way from the median voter. And do you think it's likely to be reversed, please?
Well, I think actually, one of the big things which is changing now, and this kind of links a bit to what I was saying, in my contribution, is around this view on corporations and them paying their tax around the world, the big multinationals, because I do think that is something where there has been a sense of, it's been going on for a number of years. There's a sort of slight sense individual countries are somehow powerless to do anything about it because it requires international coordination, and that international coordination, has not been forthcoming for a number of years. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of an argument around fairness. And I feel that is where there is some potential for change. And I think, the fairness plays itself out in several different ways. It plays itself out comparing a business who can shift its profits overseas versus a British-based business which cannot shift its profits anywhere. That just seems unfair. And particularly over the last year, when those British businesses, particularly high street ones, but also other ones who can't shift overseas, have been struggling and feeling the difficulty of the last year or so, that I think makes it more acute. And actually, I guess to Julian's point around crises changing people's perceptions around taxation, I think the perception of unfairness around the large multinationals and tech giants and so on was there before, but it's even more acute during a crisis when you've got high street suffering so badly and Amazon doing so well. It just makes it, people would find that a point of inequality anyway, and they would say, look, Amazon's doing really well because the delivery model is suited to a COVID world, whereas high streets have been closed for a lot of the last year. If you add on to that the fact that Amazon is paying a tiny amount of its tax that it's supposed to, or that we feel it should in terms of its corporation tax in the UK, that just compounds that sense of unfairness. And I do think there is I've seen some polling on, I was looking at it today actually, some polling on, what people's opinions are on all this. And it won't surprise you, I think, to hear that the public are overwhelmingly in favour of making this fairer and making the big tech giants and so on pay what they owe. I think maybe what's changed through the COVID pandemic is people are really aware of it, and businesses are feeling the difference as well. Those kind of British-based high street and other businesses versus the tech giants who've done really well and don't pay the tax they should.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how the concept of paying what you owe, when the tax structure doesn't impose any particular burden, or in the case of Amazon, a rather small burden. Surely it's the question of how to change the tax structure so that taxes are levied on a basis that seems more even. But anyway, Inga, your thoughts, please.
Great, thanks. So I just want to respond to Robert, because that's actually something I've looked at in another project. I mean, how the Republicans actually did it, that everyone was in essentially supporting a highly unequal system, and it's still very unequal. And what I saw in that project is essentially a number of strategies they used to bring in democratic support. What they did was they told a story of small businesses, which is always very effective with the estate tax. They offered small compensations to lower incomes, so tax credits and tax breaks for private social security items, and telling a story of the ownership society. And George W. Bush was very clever in tying this all into this compassionate conservatism, which is in a way doesn't leave anyone behind, but at the same time you have a very market-based system sitting behind it. So I think the US obviously has a long history of having this American dream tied in with taxation. But my intuition is that there's also a lot of bargaining going on in Congress, and it can go one or the other way, and it depends on how you use the context within which you operate to portray what you wanna achieve in a normative and in a functioning cognitive narrative. That would be my impression.
Thank you very much. And Julian, do you think we're going to get a modern version of Mr. Chamberlain's excess profits tax?
Yeah. I mean, predictions are always hard, especially if they concern the future. But I mean, based on what we know, I think it's more likely that major reforms that kind of depart from the way tax policy making has been made in the last decades will happen. And despite like the domestic politics that play out, what of course also plays out here, and this plays a bit to the discussion on corporate tax competition and also tax avoidance is that the international system starts to change as well. So we have that already when it comes to taxation of personal capital income, right? So with the FATCA, automatic exchange of information being established post the last crisis, basically, back then initiated by the use of power from the US under the Obama administration. So now it's much harder to actually hide capital income, which gives governments more leeway actually to increase capital gains taxes. And this is something that is hugely debated these days. And Biden has just doubled, or proposed to double actually the capital gains tax rate. So this is something that that is developing. And now we see a similar development when it comes to the proposal for more coordination when it comes to corporate taxation. Again, it's after or during a major crisis. Again, it's the US and it's the Democratic administration. And to a certain extent, I wouldn't be surprised if they also make use of the market force of the US to kind of push smaller countries into signing up, because here it's really about the small countries. They often win from tax competition because they just have an advantage in lowering tax rates because they lose less than others. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it goes ahead, because it very much mirrors what we've seen over the last decades, and the patterns are quite similar.
Well, I suppose
Martin?
Yes.
I was just wondering whether I could ask a quick follow-up, partly on James's thing, and obviously Julian and Inga are close to some of the polling evidence on this. The idea of increasing taxes on Amazon, and obviously the perception that this is a nameless foreign entity and therefore it improves fairness. As Martin, you pointed out, obviously you need to think about the way in which the incidence of this may work. Has anybody said, are you still in favour of increasing taxes on Amazon if it means that the stuff you buy from Amazon is less cheap?
Inga, you have any thoughts on that, any answers to that, or James or Julian?
Yeah, I was just nodding. I think that's a really important element in these surveys. I never did survey research, but I know quite a bit, and that if you kind of point out the different options that might be entailed in different situations, voters do have a more nuanced response, and it might even be tied to how much can we balance out the deficit, which can be a really important element as well.
James, I wonder whether you have anything to say on the question of how you think voters would react if they found or they expected that they would actually have to pay the profit tax collected from Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen that question asked in the polling I was looking at today, but I think one thing it does make me think of, which I can add to this conversation, which I think is relevant, is around the design of taxes that you might use to get a greater contribution from companies who provide digital services, because the digital services tax that the government has introduced as a and they have described it as a temporary unilateral measure ahead of some other international agreement coming together. Amazon came out and just said, well, we're going to pass it on to our marketplace sellers, and they basically were very brazen about the fact that they weren't going to absorb that cost. They were just going to pass it on. And because of their position, they probably can, in a lot of ways, just pass it on down the chain, and then whatever happens with that, it happens further down the chain. So I do think, I do think when you're designing the new mechanisms or the new taxes around large, particularly online companies, we have to think carefully about how it plays out.
Julian, do you have any thoughts on that, please? You looked as though you wanted to speak.
Yes, I do. Two things that come along with it. So yes, I would expect that such pocketbook explanations could have an impact there. What we know is that from survey research a bit in other areas that do not necessarily rule out all other explanations. So this also speaks a bit to the question on why does the median voter still support some tax cuts and does not go for massive increases in taxation. And we try to do that just recently with a survey we fielded last month in the US. And this is often just explained by their personal fairness perceptions. Right, so this is a really strong predictor where they wouldn't be affected by it, and we inform them hey, you wouldn't be affected by an increase in personal income taxation or reduction of personal income taxation. It doesn't really change their attitude. What's really driving it if you give them kind of nudge of fairness perception. But of course, this is a bit of a different setting there. When it comes to taxing digital companies, I would agree. It also depends a bit on the exact implementation and the exact approach. So generally, a tax on digital services, which would more be of a consumption tax, actually, these tend to be more unpopular because voters tend to directly connect them with what they have to pay. So they would be closer to any kind of sales taxes and so on. And basically, the taxation of digital companies is likely to get most support when it comes to the construction of the international tax system, particularly because these are digital companies, they are even better at doing transfer pricing, because it's hard to say where actually their profits are booked, and there's a lot with patents that can be done with moving their profits to low tax jurisdictions, and this is something the Biden proposal would get at least to a certain extent, and it also depends on how it is done. But this is, again, it depends. I don't know any surveys that directly looks at that, but what we know from other survey research, more likely to get support than taxing it on a national level with any kind of consumption from digital goods.
Malte, you've been wanting to make a point, ask a question, so can you please fire away?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the panel for the interesting discussion and the papers. I wanted to ask a question which I guess addresses a topic that everyone has mentioned in some shape or form, namely the recent proposals and actions, I guess, of the Biden administration, which I guess in many ways have been described as progressive, both with regards to taxation, but also with regards to the fiscal expansion. And I think this also falls then somewhat into the remit of the M&T arguments that have been brought forward that would also welcome this. What we're now also seeing, though, are for a couple of months, but now increasingly so, calls about the next kind of psychological factor that often has to be taken into account, I guess, which is we now have to be afraid again of inflation. At least we are reading the first articles of that. Martin Weale yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago in the FT wrote an article about this. There are reasons to be worried. So my question in the end is, can this really be this kind of progressive step, or are we already seeing effectively the first kind of brakes being applied to this step forward with regards to fiscal expansion and taxation because of the kind of reactivation of such worries, be they psychological or be they indeed real, such as a fear of inflation?
Well, could we perhaps take this in reverse order, please? So, Julian, your thoughts first, please. You're on mute at the moment.
There we go. Yeah, do we already see the first cracks in the system? I mean, with regards, so this would probably be more on the spending side of things and the extent to which more spending flows into the economy, because from the taxation side, generally, I haven't seen many instances where it has been strongly connected. So I think this inflation argument has been strongly made with regards to more deficits, as a criticism of modern monetary theory, which has already been mentioned, right? Because there the idea is, well, we shouldn't worry about inflation, it's all a construct and so on, or at least worry less about inflation. And I have to say I might be misinterpreting or giving it not the exact interpretation there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think fiscal imperatives are crucial here. And the fiscal imperatives will come more into place as the crisis unfolds. It was quite interesting at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, when governments around the world were, building these huge packages of stimulating the economy and so on, that the idea of how to fund it wasn't really in the public discussions. And we tried to think about it and bring it forward, but we often heard, oh, now it's not the time to talk about that. So I think the more that actually this idea comes up, okay, now we're at a certain debt level and we might think about funding it, it might give new ideas to taxation and maybe even more progressive tax policy instrument, new imperatives, because as we've already seen, I mean, in the Colombian case, for instance, there seems to be little demand of going down the way of increasing taxes on consumption or more regressive tax reforms that we've seen over the last decades even further.
Inga, please, your thoughts.
Yeah, so I don't think inflation is the main problem right now in the US, but overheating, I think, is right now probably a big problem, which might be connected with inflation. But I too wonder if the very expansive monetary policy that's conducted aligned with very expansive spending that goes directly into consumption, if that could create some problems. And we see that in the real estate market in the US right now. We've known this for, I think, 3 months, that it's on the verge of overheating or already in the middle of it. So I think some questions have to be asked. I would agree with Julian that essentially the question is a little bit where you are spending. And one way how spending, I think, can be safer in terms of these variables would be infrastructure spending, which is one of the elements, obviously, of Biden's program. And I would think that infrastructure spending and tying it to the Green New Deal, that would be a great way of investing and keeping it relatively safe for inflation. And then there's the question, and I think it could actually be one of these arguments that we could make to actually increase the top rate and increase the wealth tax, because those would be ways how you would limit the deficit to some extent. I would try and steer away from the value-added tax, because I personally think it's unfair to have the lower incomes pay the brunt of the crisis that was where the lower incomes were also the ones that were suffering most. So I would try and steer away from the value-added tax, but I would think the top rate increase and the wealth tax increase could be really good ways of limiting the deficit and hopefully also limiting pressures on an overheating market.
James, what are your thoughts, please?
Thanks, Martin. I think Inga and Julian are closer to some of the data in the US. I mean, I think there's one point that I thought of during that discussion that I'd like to add in, which is around some of the international consensus about our response to COVID and our response to the economic situation more generally, which I think is connected a little bit to a discussion we're having now, but we haven't delved into yet, which is that, I've spoken a bit around the international consensus around taxation of big corporations, multinationals, and so on. The other side of the equation, I think, where the response is very different internationally now than it was, after the great financial crisis, is around the use of fiscal policy. When you have the IMF saying very clearly we should be using fiscal policy to combat COVID and to bring down unemployment, the emphasis on growth in the economy and so on. I think it's just a very different reaction to what happened just over 10 years ago. And I say that as someone who, I've only been an MP for a couple of years, but I've been working, I've been a councillor and deputy mayor in politics for a lot longer. And the political positioning of different countries and international institutions around the world just feels very different now than it was 10 or so years ago. I would say, well, I and some of my colleagues have been arguing this for a long time, but actually I think a lot of the consensus has shifted a lot as well. And so that focus on using fiscal policy to, as I said, not only combat COVID, but also to tackle unemployment and to make sure we have growth in the economy is in a very different place now than it was a few years ago.
Robert, what are your thoughts, please?
Well, I mean, maybe Walter's original argument was, is inflation just being raised now as a spectre in order to try to divert people from progressive causes? There may be some people doing that, but I think, in part it is response to the fact that, the Biden package is a very big stimulus. So you've had people like Larry Summers, Olivier Blanchard, who are not, far-right ideologues by any stretch of the imagination, saying that this is too much of a good thing. And they're doing so, ironically, given that I think both of them have also been pretty critical about MMT for very MMT-ish reasons, which is that you should look at the merits of fiscal expansions as regards their potential impact on inflation, as distinct from their impact on debt dynamics. And I think their view is, or the Blanchard and Summers view is just this, this is just a very big stimulus, and you're going to run into bottlenecks, the sort of overheating that Inga was talking about. Now, one challenge here is that this has been a very strange and unusual type of economic contraction compared to the sort that we're used to when inflation gets out of hand and you raise interest rates and you shrink the economy and shrink demand. That you've essentially had, the government imposing a negative supply shock on the economy by restricting the economy's ability to act, but simultaneously protecting people's incomes through it. So for people trying to produce economic forecasts through this and looking further ahead, the question of whether you come out of this with, in Keynesian terms, a sort of conventional shortage of spending power in the economy that the state has to step in and make good is very hard to judge. My gut instinct is that you've seen demand and supply in the economy both shrinking simultaneously, and I would be very hard pressed to judge with any confidence which of them by more. There is probably some, weakening of demand relative to supply, but the idea that there is a big need for a fiscal stimulus purely in demand terms doesn't seem particularly powerful to me. And I think it's one of the reasons why you have not seen the same sort of pressure for a Biden-style package here as you have done in the US. There's also, I think, perhaps worth looking at the dynamics of how easy or difficult it is to do fiscal policy in the United States, and the Biden administration may be taking the view that, given that fiscal policy always requires negotiation with Congress, that gets more difficult as time goes by. If you're going to go early, you might as well go big, and that might be a justification behind it. And I think the other point to bear in mind is, so I suspect there may be some inflationary dangers in this, but in the back of people's minds will also be that if inflation does pick up, and bear in mind that the Biden package is a temporary stimulus by and large rather than a permanent one, so maybe don't panic too much about that, is that the Federal Reserve does know what to do if inflation does take off. We know that you can increase interest rates, reverse QE to try to tackle that. We're much less clear that we know what to do when you run into a serious deflation problem. So I think the Paul Krugman argument at the moment might be that he doesn't dismiss entirely the inflationary danger here, but that you have to look at this on a balance of risks. And it's better to take the risk of inflation because the Fed knows what to do if it happens, than to take the risk of deflation or the economy getting stuck into a very low activity equilibrium. So I think there's, it's again important, don't just look at one single forecast when you're a policymaker, but accept the uncertainties and say, well, what are the risks if I get it wrong in one direction or the other? And I think some people would say, okay, this is a risk, but we know what to do if it unfolds.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I must say that I've never found the deflation argument convincing. It's a concern about something that, for practical purposes, has never happened. I mean, we haven't had self-sustaining deflations. Even the 1922 deflation, prices fell by 15%, and then they stopped falling and then gradually rose when Britain eventually did come round to leaving the gold standard. And there are good reasons for deflations not being self-sustaining. Prices are very sticky downwards, and they're probably more sticky downwards now than they were in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. So, certainly, I mean, I'd agree with you to argue that we need high spending because of the risk of deflation, particularly if you look at the current level of household liquidity, doesn't seem to me very persuasive. But I was told that we should normally aim to finish at about 6 o'clock. So could I ask each member of the panel for some final thoughts? And James, perhaps if I could start with you.
Well, I think this has been a great discussion. Thank you for having me along. My final thoughts are just that if you all have some spare time on Monday afternoon and evening, watch the Parliament channel and see what I have to say. We need to get the viewing figures up a bit. No, I'm just joking. But I think it'll be an interesting, I mean, it'll be a long debate with which will go on late into the night, because as I have found, finance bills are the one sort of bill that are not guillotined. So they don't have to finish at 10 o'clock on a Monday night. They can go on. Yes, I think, as I say, I think even if you don't manage to listen to the entire debate, the points we raise around what's happening internationally with the Biden plan, G7 coming up in Cornwall next month, what the UK's role is going to be, I think will be a fascinating one to follow. And I would, encourage you all, obviously, to listen to my speech, but also to follow it more broadly as a really important, potentially game-changing moment in how we deal with taxation internationally.
Julian, are there any thoughts you'd like to, perhaps try and put into James' notes for his speech?
Well, if I had known that beforehand, I might have prepared a bit more. I mean, the two things I would stress about this, because it's kind of close to my heart, actually, and close also to what I've been working on over the last years, is the first thing is actually that despite like the more technical discussions about different inflation, deflation, macroeconomic discussion, and so on, ultimately tax policy making, and this is why maybe why it's called taxation democracy, is a political issue as well. And it's a bit of how these political issues, can be translated from demand into actual policy making. And I think that's a crucial thing to understand there as well. And I think based upon what we know about survey dynamics in recent months, there is something moving. Actually, something that has been moving since the financial crisis, I would say, with a change in orthodoxy. That's. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Inga, do you have any final thoughts, please?
Yeah, so maybe two things. First of all, a response to the deflation discussion, Martin, you had with Robert. One thing that I would like to highlight is that we're still in a recession, and essentially, I think infrastructure investment could be something really useful for employment, and we do have a lot of unemployment, I guess. And there will be, well, maybe not yet, but I guess in the future there might be more unemployment when we actually see what types of sectors will survive after the crisis. So I wonder if infrastructure investment would be a good idea. Also, tying it in with a Green New Deal, that's a good future investment. And so that's kind of the one side that I want to respond to. And then I would agree with Julian, and that's also why I do tax research. I would also think about the justice elements and what we as a society kind of think about when we think about taxation and distribution of resources and incomes in general. And I would say an increase in the top personal income tax rate would be a really good idea. That's why I did that research, and I would try and steer away from any sales tax increases and VAT tax increases. Robert,
could you offer your final thoughts from this panel?
Sure. I think one, maybe I come to the crises result in changes. Julian, I think, had earlier on had a chart showing obviously that the debt burden has gone up as a result of all the borrowing that we've been doing over the last a year to 18 months. The argument that taxes need to go up because we've borrowed a lot of money and we need to pay that back is a bogus one. And in a sense, the challenge about whether you're going to need to see more tax revenue is a flow story and not a stock story. Are we going to be spending a higher proportion of national income looking forward than we thought we were going to do prior to COVID? And are there any reasons to believe that the revenue story is lower? So I think, for seeing where the direction of tax policy goes, a lot will depend on, presumably this autumn, whether the government comes out with medium-term spending plans, which it has very sensibly concluded it's too early to put in place yet, but it will have to do so at some point. Does it feel there's a need for a bigger state, and does it then respond to that by saying, look, we can borrow more in the medium term than we previously thought was sensible, or do taxes go up? And quite a lot of fiscal loosening had happened before the COVID crisis came along, so I would suspect that if there's a big increase in spending coming, there's got to be some action on tax.
Well, thank you very much for that possibly gloomy thought. Nothing as certain as death and taxes, but this has been a discussion that certainly I've found very interesting, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. So could we please electronically clap the panel to thank them for giving us such interesting insights into the issue of taxation at the moment.